You know that weird, unsettling feeling of déjà vu, right? Like your brain misfires for a split second and you swear you've lived this exact moment before? Most of the time, it's harmless. You brush it off. But I'm going to tell you about a time when déjà vu wasn't just a glitch in the matrix. It was a physical, horrifying reminder that some things in this world do not move on. They just sit in the dark, and they wait for you to come back. Honestly, to really make you understand how messed up this is, I have to take you way back. I'm a local, born and raised in Đà Lạt, a mountain town here in Vietnam that's famous for its pine forests and year-round cold weather. And I mean, I'm in my late 30s now, so I'm talking about roughly 20 years ago, maybe back in 2003 or 2004. I don't remember the exact year, but my brain has permanently bookmarked the feeling of the town back then. It was completely different from the bustling tourist trap it is today. Back then, Đà Lạt was quiet. It was vastly spread out, the fog was incredibly thick, almost suffocating, and the pine forests were dense and untouched. The roads were decent if you stayed right in the city center near the main market, but man, the second you rode your bike maybe a mile or two outside the center, the paved roads just vanished into these rough dirt paths. Anyway, I was around 15 or 16 at the time, just a dumb teenager who thought she knew everything, and I had this boyfriend. Let's just call him Patrick. So Patrick and I, we were in that sickeningly sweet puppy love phase. Every evening we'd ride our bicycles around the hills. Now there was this one specific stretch of road we called Slope Number 5. It's on the way to the outskirts, heading towards the neighboring provinces. Today, if you go there, that slope is absolutely packed with these trendy aesthetic cafes where tourists sit to look down into the valleys. But 20 years ago, there was nothing. Just dirt, wild grass, and absolute darkness. It must have been a little past 7:30 p.m. And in Đà Lạt, once the sun dips, the temperature just plummets and the streets empty out. You'd occasionally see a local flying down the steep dirt hills on a motorbike, totally reckless. But other than that, it was just dead quiet. No streetlights, just the faint, distant glow from the greenhouses down in the valley. So Patrick, trying to be this romantic guy, tells me he found a new secret spot. He pedals his bike all the way to my house, picks me up, and I'm sitting on the back rack while he labors up these massive hills for nearly 45 minutes. We finally reached the top of Slope Number 5. I remember complaining, asking him what the big deal was, considering we rode past this area all the time, but he just smiled, pulled the bike off the main dirt road, and pushed through this thick patch of overgrown bushes. He led me to this little dirt outcropping, a small ledge that jutted out over the hillside, maybe just wide enough to park a car. He laid down a jacket, and we sat there right near the edge, and I have to admit, it was breathtaking. If you looked to the left, you saw the faint lights of the sleeping town and the silhouette of the massive mountains in the distance. To the right, you could see the glowing glass of the agricultural greenhouses far below. We were sitting there, my head resting on his shoulder, talking about whatever nonsense teenagers talk about. It was perfect. But that perfection lasted maybe 5 minutes. Because as we were sitting there, huddled together against the biting chill, Patrick suddenly tensed up. We were sitting maybe 2 feet away from the actual drop-off of the cliff. Patrick was kind of hunched forward, his knees pulled up, looking down into the pitch-black abyss right below our feet. I asked him what was wrong, and he hushed me, saying he kept hearing this weird, repetitive rustling noise down the slope, figuring it was probably just a stray dog or a feral cat rooting around in the brush. I strained my eyes in the dark, pushing my hair back, but I couldn't see a damn thing. Then he pointed, his finger trembling just a little, telling me to look at this specific clump of tall grass just over the edge because it was violently shaking. Now my first thought was snakes. I am terrified of snakes. But a snake sliding over dirt doesn't make a heavy bush thrash back and forth like that. Whatever was down there had mass. It had weight. I was getting seriously annoyed. Like, here I am, thinking I'm about to get my first real romantic kiss under the stars, and this guy is obsessing over a raccoon or whatever. I told him to just ignore it and focus on me, dropping all these obvious hints that we should just make out or go home before my mom realized I was gone. He kind of chuckled, turning back to me, saying something sweet about how we had been together for 6 months, and right before I could reply, he violently flinched. He scrambled onto his knees, leaning perilously over the edge of the drop-off, calling out into the dark. I was so confused, asking him who the hell he was talking to. He looked back at me, his face pale in the moonlight, and muttered that he just heard a voice down there, a human voice. He said it sounded like someone groaning, begging for help to be pulled up. My stomach instantly tied itself into a cold, heavy knot. We were at the edge of a massive, steep drop. If someone had fallen down there in the pitch black, they could be seriously hurt. I stood up, brushing the dirt off my jeans, nervously peering over his shoulder. I didn't hear anything. I didn't see anything. I just stood there, uselessly asking if someone was down there. Patrick, being the brave teenage guy, told me to step back from the edge. He said he was going to climb down just a little bit to see if he could reach whoever it was, because he was convinced it was the voice of an older woman. I begged him not to. The slope was practically vertical, just loose dirt and sharp rocks, but he brushed off my concerns, saying he hiked these hills with his buddies all the time and knew how to slide down safely. So he sat on the edge and slowly began to scoot himself down the precipice, using his heels to brake and his hands to grip the thick roots of the wild grass. He slid down maybe 10 feet into the darkness, the sounds of shifting dirt and snapping twigs echoing loudly in the quiet night. Then, he stopped. He anchored himself, reached his hand out further down into the darkness, and started speaking in this incredibly gentle, reassuring tone. He kept saying things like, "Here, grab my hand. Let me help you. Oh my God, how did you fall all the way down here? Just hold on tight." I was standing at the top, squinting so hard my head hurt, wondering how I couldn't hear the person he was talking to. I still couldn't see anyone. I couldn't hear any crying, just Patrick's voice. And then, everything went to hell. Without any warning, Patrick let out this guttural, horrific shriek. It wasn't a scream of surprise. It was the raw, primal sound of absolute terror. He violently recoiled, twisting his body around on the steep slope, and started scrambling back up the dirt wall like a wild animal. His face, I will never forget his face. It was completely drained of blood, his eyes bulging out of his skull, filled with a panic that was so infectious it made my knees buckle. He clawed his way over the ledge, and I grabbed the collar of his jacket to haul him the rest of the way up. We both tumbled backward into the dirt, rolling over each other. He didn't even pause to catch his breath. He just scrambled to his feet, screaming at me to run, screaming that there were ghosts, that we needed to get the fuck out of there right now. I was completely paralyzed with confusion, but when the guy you love is having a mental breakdown, your survival instincts just take the wheel. We unlocked the bikes with shaking hands and we rode. We bombed down that dirt hill in the pitch black like lunatics. We wiped out twice, scraping the skin off our knees and elbows on the gravel, but we didn't care. We just picked up the bikes and kept pedaling until my lungs felt like they were bleeding. We didn't stop until we hit the center of town, right by the main lake, where there were a few late-night street vendors and motorbike taxi drivers hanging around. We slumped down at a small plastic table, the bright street lights finally offering some safety, and ordered 2 cups of steaming hot soy milk. Patrick was shivering so violently he could barely hold the plastic cup. The cold night air in Dalat is harsh, but he was shivering from the inside out. Once he finally caught his breath, he told me what happened down on that slope. He said that as he slid down, he finally saw where the rustling was coming from. Clinging to the side of the dirt wall was a very old woman. She had one of those traditional woven wicker baskets strapped to her back, the kind the indigenous locals use to forage for wood or wild fruit. She was lying flat against the steep dirt, her frail fingers desperately gripping a clump of weeds. Patrick said she slowly tilted her head back to look at him, and her face was ancient. Not just old, but unnaturally weathered, covered in deep, dark wrinkles. Her face was scratched and bleeding, like she had tumbled a long way down through the thorns. He said she looked so incredibly pitiful, groaning and begging for him to pull her up. So, he extended his hand. He told me that the second she grabbed his hand, his heart almost stopped. Her grip was insanely strong. For a frail, tiny old woman, her fingers locked onto his wrist like an industrial vice. It hurt. It genuinely felt like his bones were grinding together. But the worst part was the temperature. Dalat is freezing, but he said her skin felt like plunging his hand into a bucket of crushed ice. It was a deep, biting cold that shot straight up his arm and numbed his shoulder. He braced his feet against a root, gritted his teeth, and pulled with all his teenage strength. But she wouldn't budge. He said it felt like he was trying to pull up a cement block. It was like she was actively resisting him, dragging him closer to the edge. He yelled at her that she was too heavy, and he decided to give it one massive final heave, thinking maybe it would hurt her arm, but it was better than letting her fall. So he counted to 3 in his head, leaned all his weight backward, and yanked. And as he pulled, he heard this wet, tearing sound. He fell backward onto the dirt slope as the sudden release of tension sent him flying. He quickly looked down to see if she had fallen. She hadn't fallen. She was still plastered to the side of the cliff, but her arm was gone. He had literally ripped her arm completely out of its socket. He stared at her in absolute horror, and she looked back at him, but she wasn't groaning anymore. Her eyes, which had looked so tired and pitiful just a second ago, were now glowing a deep, sickly red in the dark. They were wide and manic, and she started to smile. She just hung there on the side of the cliff, missing an arm, staring at him with those red eyes, and she let out this silent, shaking laugh. Her shoulders were heaving, but no sound came out of her mouth. Patrick was hyperventilating as he told me this, saying he looked down at his own hand, expecting to see a severed, bloody limb, but he wasn't holding an arm. He was tightly gripping a dry, dead tree branch. It was roughly the thickness of a human wrist. In the span of a single blink, the freezing hand he was holding had turned into a piece of dead wood. That's when his mind shattered. He threw the branch into the dark and scrambled up the cliff to me. Hearing that story as a 14-year-old girl, it messed me up. I was so traumatized, I made him swear we would never, ever go near slope number 5 again. Eventually, as years passed, Patrick and I drifted apart, not because of the ghost, just typical teenage stuff. We broke up, went our separate ways, but remained decent friends. We grew up, went to high school, got new partners. Later, I moved to Saigon for about 6 or 7 years to study and build my career, completely disconnecting from my hometown for a long while. Fast forward to around 2015, I finally moved back to Dalat for work. Naturally, I reconnected with my old high school friend group, including Patrick. We were all adults now, in our late 20s, catching up on life. Someone suggested we go grab coffee, mentioning that the town had changed so much and there were all these amazing new spots. They suggested this very famous, incredibly beautiful cafe built right into the side of a hill. They mentioned it was located on the road we used to call slope number 5. Honestly, it had been over a decade. The memory of that terrifying night had faded into this blurry, almost unreal childhood nightmare. Patrick and I barely ever thought about it. So, a group of 8 of us drove out there on a Saturday night. The place was unrecognizable. It was gorgeous, completely paved over, decorated with imported pine trees, warm string lights, and packed with hundreds of tourists. It was so crowded we actually had to wait for a table. The staff eventually led us down a series of wooden stairs to a secluded, slightly cramped table near the back, right up against the edge of the property line which looked out over the valley. We were having a great time, laughing, sharing old stories. About 20 minutes in, Patrick excused himself to use the restroom. Because the cafe was built on a steep incline, the restroom was located about 20 feet away from our table, situated right on the edge of the property where the manicured garden met the wild, untamed hillside. I happened to be watching him because I needed to use the restroom next and was waiting for him to finish. I saw him push the wooden door open and step out into the cool night air. He took 2 steps, and then he stopped dead in his tracks. I watched him slowly turn his head toward the boundary of the cafe. The property was separated from the wild cliffside by this rustic, waist-high fence made of thick, planted wooden stakes with light bulbs strung between them. Patrick just stood there, staring at the dark bushes just beyond the fence. Then, his whole demeanor changed. He suddenly lunged forward, throwing his torso over the wooden fence, reaching his arms frantically down into the darkness. He started yelling, not in fear, but in urgency. He yelled back at our table, demanding that the guys come help him pull someone up. He screamed that an old woman had slipped over the edge and was hanging onto the dirt. A few of the guys immediately pushed their chairs back to run over and help, but before they could even take 3 steps, I watched Patrick violently throw his weight backward. He yanked his arms up with extreme force, stumbling backward and crashing into the wooden fence. The force of his body snapped the decorative stakes, tearing the string lights down and plunging that entire section of the cafe into darkness. He was scrambling backward on the patio floor, desperately wiping his hands on his jeans, staring at a thick piece of the broken wooden fence he had inadvertently ripped out of the ground. Our friends rushed over in the dark, asking where the woman was, asking if he was okay. Patrick didn't say a word. He was pale, sweating profusely in the freezing air, his chest heaving. He refused to look over the edge. He just kept shaking his head, his voice trembling, saying there was no woman. He demanded we leave immediately. He wouldn't take no for an answer. We hadn't even gotten all our drinks yet, but he practically sprinted to the register, threw cash on the counter, and walked out to the street. We followed him, totally bewildered, and relocated to a cheap, brightly lit street vendor in the middle of town. Once he finally calmed down, staring blankly into a cup of hot tea, he looked at me, and he told the group what had just happened. He said he walked out of the bathroom, and he heard the rustling. It was the exact same heavy, deliberate thrashing in the bushes just beyond the cafe's lights. He looked over the fence, and he saw a hand waving in the darkness, and heard the frail, raspy voice of an old woman begging to be pulled up. He said his brain just went into autopilot. It had been 15 years. The area was completely transformed. He honestly thought a clumsy tourist had wandered past the fence and fallen. He lunged over the barrier, reached down, and grabbed the woman's hand, but the second his fingers wrapped around hers, the realization hit him like a freight train. It was the cold. That impossible, bone-crushing cold, and the vice-like grip that felt like it was grinding his knuckles into dust. In that agonizing split second, his adult brain synced up with his teenage memory. He realized exactly where he was standing. He realized exactly whose hand he was holding. He looked down, and through the dim ambient light of the cafe, he saw her. The exact same weathered face, the exact same woven basket strapped to her back. He panicked and tried to pull his hand away, jerking his body backward. And just like 15 years ago, her arm detached from her shoulder. He watched the limbs separate from her body, and he saw her eyes burn that sickening bright red as she smiled that silent, shaking smile. He fell backward into the patio, and when he opened his eyes, the severed arm in his grasp was just a broken piece of the cafe's wooden fence. When he finished telling us, the entire table went dead silent. The chill in the air suddenly felt a lot more malicious. Looking back at it now, as an adult, the sheer statistical impossibility of it all is what keeps me up at night. What are the odds that, out of hundreds of new cafes in Dalat, we randomly chose to walk into the exact one built directly over that specific patch of dirt? What are the odds that the staff sat us at the very back, pushing Patrick to use a restroom position precisely over the drop-off, where he almost lost his mind 15 years ago? It wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. It makes you realize how utterly powerless we are against the things that dwell in the dark. We paved over the dirt roads. We strung up pretty lights. We brought in hundreds of laughing tourists and played loud music, thinking we had civilized the wild, thinking we had chased the shadows away. But we didn't chase anything away. We just built a coffee shop on top of her hunting ground. She's still down there, clinging to the dirt in the pitch black, waiting with that dead, freezing hand. And honestly, the worst part is wondering what would have happened if Patrick hadn't let go of the branch. What if he had actually managed to pull her up into the light? Honestly, if you were to ask me right now to show you pictures from my childhood, I really couldn't give you much. And it's not because we were poor or didn't have cameras, it's just I physically cannot bring myself to keep old digital files anymore. I don't trust them. I don't trust the idea that a piece of silicon and wire can trap a moment in time, because I know for an absolute fact that sometimes when you take a picture of the dark takes a picture of you right back, and it hitches a ride in your pocket. Look, I don't know exactly what year it was, maybe 13 or 14 years ago, back when I was in the 9th grade. My name is Ben, by the way. Back then, my family had this massive tradition of doing these huge summer road trips. We'd pack everyone up and go to coastal towns, down south, everywhere. But the one place we always ended up circling back to was Dalat. If you've never been, Dalat is this mountain town in the highlands, a place completely perpetually swallowed by cold mist, where the pine trees look like jagged black teeth against the night sky, and the roads just twist around these steep, fatal drops. It's beautiful during the day, but at night, the fog literally eats the headlights of your car, and the damp cold just seeps right into your bones. Anyway, this particular summer trip was different because my Uncle Bill came along. Uncle Bill was, well, he was a character. He wasn't some soft suburban dad. The guy was a hardened ex-cop who spent his career in the anti-smuggling division, busting cartels and dealing with the worst kinds of people in the absolute worst kinds of places. He had this massive macho complex, always puffing his chest out, always trying to prove he was the toughest guy in the room. He even carried a handgun with him on family vacations. He later admitted he never actually kept it loaded while traveling with us kids. It was just an intimidation tactic, a metal prop to make him feel invincible. So we were up in Dalat, and we had spent the whole first day doing normal tourist stuff, visiting flower gardens, waterfalls, just a load of crap that teenagers like me found incredibly boring. By the second night, we were all back at the hotel, winding down. It was probably past 10 p.m., just freezing rain outside. I was half asleep when Uncle Bill just starts pounding on our room door. He bursts in, completely restless, and he looks at me and my cousin Brad, his son, who was exactly my age, and he just starts laying into us about how we're acting like old men. He told us to get up, put our coats on, and said he was taking us to the haunted house on the Pren Mountain Pass. Now, even 13 years ago, everyone knew about the Pren Pass house. It's this massive, decaying, French colonial mansion sitting abandoned right on the edge of a winding mountain road. It had a reputation that spanned decades. Stories about people hanging themselves, bodies being dumped in the wells, just pure, concentrated misery. I instantly felt the hairs on my arms stand up. I tried to tell him that going out in the freezing rain at midnight to a condemned building was a terrible idea. But Uncle Bill just laughed. He called us cowards and said it was time to build some character. So, we ended up stuffing 8 people into a single taxi. It was me, Brad, Uncle Bill, another male relative, and a few of the girls in the family. The ride up the mountain pass was suffocating. The heater in the cab smelled like burnt dust, and the fog outside was so thick you couldn't see 3 feet past the windshield. When we finally pulled up to the rusted gates of the mansion, the girls took one look at the pitch-black silhouette of the house looming against the fog and flat out refused to leave the car. I didn't blame them. The place radiated this heavy, nauseating energy, but the 4 of us guys, led by Uncle Bill, stepped out into the freezing mud. Here is something a lot of people don't know about these abandoned sites. They aren't always empty. Sometimes, opportunists squat there. When we walked into the main hall, pushing past a heavy, rotting wooden door, we were greeted by a local couple. They were illegal caretakers, squatters who basically gatekept the ruins. They made their living by extorting thrill seekers. If you slipped them some cash, they'd act as tour guides and tell you the gruesome history of the place. Uncle Bill, not wanting to deal with trespass warnings, just peeled off a few $100,000 dong, maybe like 15 or 20 bucks, which was decent money for them, and told the woman to show us around. The woman pulled out this incredibly weak, flickering flashlight, and the tour began. The house smelled like wet decay, rat droppings, and the sickly sweet scent of old, burnt incense. She led us through these cavernous, peeling rooms. In her broken, raspy voice, she pointed to a corner and casually mentioned that a girl had overdosed and died right there. Then she took us to a balcony and claimed a pregnant woman had thrown herself off it. Honestly, it sounded like absolute bullshit. It felt rehearsed, like a theatrical performance meant to justify the $20 we gave her. I was terrified, sure, because the atmosphere was suffocating, but my brain was constantly gaslighting me, telling me that this lady was just a scammer and we were just gullible tourists in a dirty old house. But then, we reached a narrow, crumbling stone staircase leading downwards. The woman stopped dead in her tracks. She turned off her flashlight, plunging us into almost total darkness, and her entire demeanor shifted. The scammer persona dropped completely. She told us, in a very quiet, serious tone, that the basement down there was the only place in the house she refused to enter. She indirectly explained that terrible things happened down there decades ago involving kidnapped girls, and that she and her husband regularly heard muffled crying and scratching sounds coming from beneath the floorboards at night. Uncle Bill just scoffed. He thought it was the grand finale of her little scam. He demanded she open the rusted padlock on the basement door. She aggressively refused, warning us that the entity down there was hostile and highly active. That's when Uncle Bill went full cop mode. He started lecturing her, bragging about his anti-smuggling days. He told her he had spent nights staking out criminal drop points in the middle of massive, overgrown graveyards, sleeping on top of anonymous graves with hundreds of dead bodies beneath him. He practically yelled that he wasn't afraid of a single ghost when he had slept among thousands. He demanded the key again. The woman didn't argue anymore. She just handed it over, her hands shaking, and backed away. Uncle Bill grabbed the rusted key, shoved it into the padlock, and forced it open. The heavy wooden door creaked open, exhaling this breath of air that was so unnaturally freezing, it literally smelled like an open freezer full of spoiled meat. I remember watching him reach into his waistband and pull out his unloaded gun, holding it by his side just to look tough in front of us. He puffed his chest out, gave us a smirk, and took a step down into the pitch-black stairwell. He was out of our sight for maybe 5 seconds. I was standing near the top of the stairs, staring into the dark, expecting him to yell out a joke or try to jump scare us. But the silence was absolutely suffocating until I heard this frantic, heavy scrambling sound, almost like a large animal losing its footing on the stone steps. And the worst part was I could hear his breathing, ragged and desperate, completely void of any of the macho confidence he had just displayed. Uncle Bill burst out of the stairwell, nearly tripping over his own feet. He slammed his shoulder into the door frame, breathing heavily. I looked at his face in the dim, ambient light, and my stomach instantly tied into knots. The man was completely drenched in cold sweat. His skin was the color of old newspaper, absolutely drained of blood. His eyes were wide, darting around the room, and his hands, the hands of a veteran cop, were trembling so hard that the metal of his gun was clicking against his wedding ring. My cousin Brad asked him what he saw. Uncle Bill blinked hard, swallowed visibly, and forced this incredibly fake, shaky laugh. He hastily put the gun back in his waistband and claimed he was just messing with us, that he ran up just to see if we would get scared. But his voice cracked. He wasn't looking at us. He was staring at the closed basement door. He immediately started walking briskly toward the exit, telling us the tour was over and we needed to leave. But Brad, my cousin, had inherited his dad's stubborn pride. He pulled out his phone, one of those old, bulky Nokia brick phones that had a built-in camera and a blindingly bright xenon flash. He said he wanted to go down and snap a few pictures just to show his friends at school. Uncle Bill froze. He turned around and vehemently forbade Brad from going down there. But Brad challenged him, asking why he couldn't go if there was nothing down there to be afraid of. Uncle Bill was trapped by his own ego. He couldn't admit he ran from something, so he just gritted his teeth, his jaw visibly clenching, and stepped aside, telling Brad to make it quick. Brad jogged down the steps. A second later, A brilliant white flash illuminated the dark stairwell, followed by another. Brad came trotting back up, completely unfazed, holding his Nokia. He looked at the screen and complained that it was just an empty, dirty room with some old makeshift shrines. We left the house immediately. The walk back to the taxi was completely silent. None of us felt victorious. When we got into the cab, the driver tried to start the engine. It sputtered and died. My heart plummeted into my shoes. He tried again. Nothing. The driver muttered something under his breath, visibly panicked, saying he never should have taken a fare to this cursed place. We sat in the freezing car, surrounded by the fog, and I just kept staring at the rear-view mirror, expecting to see something wet and pale crawling out of the mansion gates. After what felt like an eternity, the engine finally roared to life on the fourth try, and we sped down the mountain. Back at the hotel room, the adrenaline started wearing off, and the teenage stupidity kicked in. The guys all gathered around Brad's Nokia to look at the photos. They were blurry, low-resolution shots of a damp concrete basement. In the corner of one of the photos, near a small incense burner, there was this smudge, a hazy, white artifact that looked like a glitch in the pixels. Brad and the other relative thought it was hilarious. They immediately turned on their phone's Bluetooth, because this was before smartphones and cloud sharing, and started slowly transferring the image file to each other's phones. They wanted to use it as proof they survived the haunted house. They asked if I wanted them to beam the photo to my phone. I looked at that smudge on the tiny screen, and my gut completely inverted. Every primal instinct I had screamed at me. I told them no. I told them they were idiots and I wanted absolutely nothing to do with it. I just rolled over in my bed and faced the wall. That night was the longest night of my life. Uncle Bill was sleeping in a separate room with his wife, so it was just us guys in our room. I eventually drifted off, but I kept waking up to the sounds of my cousins tossing and turning. The room felt incredibly heavy, like the air pressure had dropped. I was laying there, paralyzed by the cold, when I heard the distinct sound of the heavy wooden wardrobe doors creaking open on their own, followed by the bathroom faucet slowly turning on, letting out this steady, sickening drip that echoed against the tiles. I squeezed my eyes shut, mentally gaslighting myself, trying to rationalize that the hotel was old, the wind was blowing the doors, the pipes were leaky. But then I heard Brad gasp. He started thrashing in the bed next to mine, whimpering, complaining loudly that someone was yanking the blankets off his legs. The other guy on the floor was making these choked, gagging sounds, like his chest was being crushed. I lay there, completely frozen, sweating through my shirt, praying to whatever was listening that it wouldn't notice me. I was the only one who didn't take the photo, and I was the only one left untouched. When the sun finally came up, the room looked like a disaster area. My cousins were pale, exhausted, and visibly traumatized. They started exchanging notes about the sleep paralysis, the feeling of icy hands wrapping around their ankles, the suffocating weight on their chests. We went down to the hotel restaurant for breakfast. Uncle Bill was already there, drinking black coffee. He looked like he hadn't slept a wink. He had dark purple bags under his eyes. The guys immediately started complaining to him about the haunted hotel room, excitedly telling him about the doors opening and the blankets being pulled. Normally, Uncle Bill would have slapped the table, called them delusional, and told them to man up, but he didn't. He just sat there, staring into his coffee mug, completely silent. Brad, trying to prove he wasn't crazy, pulled out his Nokia and shoved the basement photo in his dad's face. He pointed at the blurry white smudge and said, "Look, we caught it on camera. It followed us." I was watching Uncle Bill's face. The moment his eyes registered that blurry white shape on the screen, his entire demeanor shattered. I saw the skin on his face tighten, his breathing hitched, and the hair on his arms literally stood straight up. He pushed the phone away from him like it was physically burning his hand. He looked at us, his eyes wide and completely defeated. And then he confessed. He told us that when he walked down those stairs and reached the bottom, he didn't see a blurry smudge. He saw her. He said the air was so cold it burned his lungs. He looked into the corner, by the incense burners, and he saw a young woman crouching on the floor. She was hugging her knees to her chest, her head tucked down. Uncle Bill said she wasn't transparent or ghostly. She looked solid. She looked horrifyingly real. And he could hear her. He heard this wet, agonizing sobbing echoing off the concrete walls. The primal panic kicked in. He said his brain short-circuited. Out of pure, blind survival instinct, he whipped out his gun and aimed it directly at the crouching girl's head. His finger trembling on the trigger, completely forgetting the gun was empty. He said the second he aimed the weapon, the sobbing stopped. The girl slowly started to raise her head, and then, right before his fucking eyes, she just dissolved. She didn't run away. She just started turning into mist, fading into the damp concrete walls over the course of 3 agonizing seconds until the corner was completely empty. That was when he broke and ran up the stairs. He sat there at the breakfast table, an ex-cop who had faced down armed criminals, looking like a terrified child. He admitted he was too ashamed to stop Brad from going down, and he had been silently praying Brad wouldn't see what he saw. The table went dead silent. Nobody ate another bite. We packed up and left a lot that very same morning. But the nightmare didn't stay in the mountains. Over the next 2 days of the road trip, the 3 Nokia phones that had the photo saved on their memory cards started behaving completely erratically. At first, it was just minor glitches. The phones would vibrate violently for no reason when placed on a table. The batteries would drain from full to zero in a matter of minutes. Then, the screen started freezing, and the keypads became completely unresponsive. By the time we crossed the city limits back into our hometown, all 3 phones simultaneously completely bricked themselves. They wouldn't turn on. They wouldn't charge. They were just dead pieces of plastic and metal. My phone, the only one that didn't receive the Bluetooth transfer, worked perfectly fine. When they took the phones to a repair shop a few days later, the technicians were baffled. They said the hardware seemed fine, but the internal software was completely corrupted, violently scrambled by something they couldn't explain. The only way to make the phones usable again was to perform a deep, factory-level wipe of the hard drives. They had to delete everything, every text message, every contact, and every single photograph taken on that trip. They wiped the phones, and magically, they turned back on. But Brad and my other cousin couldn't look at the devices the same way anymore. They ended up selling them to a pawn shop the very next week at a massive loss. Looking back now, as an adult, I constantly think about the mechanics of what happened. I think about how a digital camera captures light, and how Bluetooth transfers data through invisible radio waves in the air. We wiped the hard drives, sure. We deleted the zeros and ones that made up her blurry image. But sometimes, when I'm lying in bed and my own house settles, making the wardrobe creak, I stare at the dark corner of my bedroom. I can't help but wonder. When you delete a digital file of something that shouldn't exist, does it really just go away? Or did we just destroy the cage, leaving whatever hitched a ride in that Nokia phone completely free to roam wherever it wants? I really don't know the answer. And honestly, I pray to God I never find out. Honestly, the most messed up part wasn't seeing an apparition. It wasn't the creeping dread of an empty forest, or even finding out the gruesome history of a place after the fact. No, the absolute worst part was sitting in a brightly lit, perfectly normal hotel room, watching my best friend's jaw unhinge slightly, her eyes completely vacant, as a voice that belonged to a dead 12-year-old boy crawled out of her throat. It was her own vocal cords vibrating, her own lips moving, but the cadence, the desperation, the sheer terror in that voice, it wasn't her. It was a drowned kid using her body like a cheap radio to beg for help. Anyway, I should probably back up. I need to explain how we even got into that situation, because I still run it through my head every single night, trying to figure out where exactly we crossed the line. So, this happened back in 2020. Me, my buddy Quinn, my friend Phoebe, her boyfriend, and another couple, 6 of us in total, decided to take a trip up to Dalate. For those who don't know, Dalate is this mountain city in the Central Highlands, It's famous for pine forests, winding mountain passes, French-style villas, and usually this really crisp, romantic chill in the air. People go there to wear sweaters, drink hot soy milk, and take aesthetic photos for social media. But our trip was absolutely cursed from the moment we crossed the province line. The weather was just crap. It rained, and I don't mean a passing shower. I mean a relentless, gray, soul-crushing downpour that didn't stop for 3 days straight. It varied between a torrential flood and this annoying, bone-chilling drizzle that coated everything in a layer of freezing moisture. Look, when you have 6 energetic 20-somethings crammed into a couple of hotel rooms, staring at wet windows, the cabin fever sets in fast. We spent the whole first morning just sitting on our beds, scrolling our phones, groaning about our ruined vacation. Eventually, we couldn't take it anymore. We booked a ride-hailing app, a grab car, just to go grab some local meatballs and bread near the market. While we were driving back, all wet and miserable, complaining loudly in the back of the 7-seater about how there was nothing to do, the driver chimed in. I don't blame the guy. I really don't. He was just trying to be helpful, trying to save our vacation. He told us that up here in the highlands, the weather is hyper-localized. He said that even if it's pouring in the city center, you could just cross a ridge or drive a few miles down a mountain pass and it might be completely dry. Then he suggested this new eco park. I won't say the real name because honestly, I don't want any of you trying to find it, so let's just call it the ABC Park. He told us it was newly opened, super trendy, massive, and located behind a specific mountain where the rain clouds usually didn't reach. He hyped it up, saying there were archery ranges, flower gardens, and this massive natural lake where you could paddle around on bamboo rafts. We immediately pulled up the park on our phones, and sure enough, it looked amazing. All these influencers had posted pictures there. We were bored out of our minds, so we asked the driver to just take us there right then and there. It cost us a few $100,000, maybe 15 or 20 bucks, which is a fairly long ride by local standards. We drove for almost 40 minutes, winding down these increasingly narrow, empty roads lined with dense, dark pine trees. Now, when we finally pulled up to the entrance, it was maybe 3:17 p.m. The driver dropped us off, wished us luck, and drove away. The first thing I noticed was how dead quiet it was. The driver was right about one thing. It wasn't raining heavily here, just a very fine, almost invisible mist. But the parking lot was completely empty. We walked up to the ticket booth, which was a good 200 meters inside the main gate, and the lady inside literally jolted awake. She looked so shocked to see paying customers. She sold us our tickets, handed us a damp paper map, and told us to have fun. The park was divided into different zones. We spent the next couple of hours just wandering. We went through Zone A, taking photos with some artificial flower setups. Then we hiked over to Zone B, which took forever, and messed around with the free archery and dart games. By the time we finished there, the daylight was fading fast. It must have been around 5:43 p.m., or something oddly specific like that, when we finally headed down the dirt trail toward Zone C, which was where the big lake was. If you've never been in a dense mountain forest at dusk, you need to understand how quickly the light dies. The sun doesn't just set. The shadows from the trees seem to bleed out and swallow the sky. The temperature plummeted. When we got down to the lake level, we saw a lone park employee packing up some life jackets. I politely asked him where we could find the bamboo rafts for the photo ops. He looked at his watch, frowned, and told us that it was really too late, that the water was dangerous when it got dark. We practically begged him, pointing out we were the only 6 people left in the entire park and we had paid full price just to see the lake. He sighed, rubbed his face, and mumbled that we could go down to the pier, but if anything happened, he wasn't responsible. At the time, I just thought he meant if we slipped and sprained an ankle. He didn't want the paperwork. I didn't realize he was talking about something else entirely. So, we walked down to the edge of the water. The lake was roughly the size of a small football field, surrounded by tall black pines. The water was incredibly still, looking like a sheet of dark glass. And there, right in the middle of the lake, was a bamboo raft. It was a pretty big raft, big enough to hold maybe 10 people, constructed out of thick bamboo logs tied together. It was connected to a thick mooring rope that stretched all the way back to a wooden post near our feet. We stood there, annoyed, wondering how we were supposed to get the raft to the shore. That was when we heard it. The silence of the lake was absolute until I heard this sudden echoing giggle of a young boy, followed by a hollow, rhythmic splashing sound, just a wet thwack of wood hitting water over and over again. We all squinted out into the gloom. About 30 meters out, standing right on the edge of that bamboo raft, was a kid. He looked maybe 11 or 12. He was dressed like a typical tourist up here for the cold. Jeans, a long-sleeved shirt, a thick scarf, and a little knit beanie. He had a long wooden pole, and he was casually pushing it into the water, pretending to paddle, completely ignoring us. We all started grumbling. We complained to each other about how this brat was hogging the only raft, how selfish kids are, and how we were going to lose the last bit of daylight waiting for him to finish playing. We even cupped our hands and yelled out to him, asking him if he was done and if he could pull the raft in so we could take a turn. He didn't answer. He just kept his back to us, slowly punting the raft in a tight little circle, looking like he was having the time of his life. Right around then, Phoebe shifted on her feet and told us she really needed to use the restroom. The bathrooms were a wooden structure about 50 meters back up the dirt path, tucked into the trees. She told us to hold her spot and that she'd be right back, and she jogged off into the dark alone. So, 5 of us were left standing at the edge of the lake, shivering, getting more and more annoyed at this kid. We turned away for a second to take some group selfies near some decorative rocks. While we were doing that, the employee we had spoken to earlier came walking down the path. He approached us, looking confused, and asked if we still wanted to take photos on the raft because he needed to pull it in and lock it up for the night. I told him we were just waiting for the kid out there to finish up so we could have a turn. The employee stopped dead in his tracks. He looked at me, his face dropping, and told me that was impossible. He said the last family had left the park over 2 hours ago, and that we were the only guests remaining on the entire property. I actually laughed. I thought he was messing with us. I pointed a finger out toward the middle of the lake and told him to look for himself. We all turned our heads back to the water. The raft was exactly where it had been, 30 meters out, but it was completely, utterly empty. My brain immediately did that thing where it aggressively tries to protect you from reality. I started rationalizing furiously. I thought, maybe the kid fell in? But there were no ripples. Maybe he swam to the other side, but it was too far, and we would have heard splashing. I looked at the employee, expecting an explanation, but the guy didn't say a word. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look for a drowning child. He just got this grim, tight expression on his face, walked past us, grabbed the thick mooring rope, and started hauling the heavy bamboo raft back to the shore, hand over hand. He didn't look at the water once. He just kept pulling. A heavy, suffocating feeling settled over my chest. The hairs on my arms stood straight up. None of us said a word. We just watched this guy silently drag an empty raft through the black water. It scared the crap out of me. It was so undeniably wrong. Before any of us could process what was happening, a scream shattered the quiet. It was Phoebe. We whipped around and saw her sprinting down the dirt path from the bathrooms. She wasn't running toward us. She was running a dead sprint toward the main exit of the park, completely bypassing the lake. She was screaming in this raw, panicked pitch, dropping her scarf, stumbling, but just keeping her head down and running. The 5 of us instantly abandoned the lake and bolted after her. We chased her all the way up the trails, through the zones, our lungs burning, until we finally caught up to her, near the entrance gate. She was collapsed on a stone bench under a single flickering streetlight, sobbing hysterically, mascara running down her face, hyperventilating so hard I thought she was going to pass out. We surrounded her, grabbing her shoulders, begging her to tell us what happened, what chased her. Between gasps of air, she managed to choke out the story. She told us she had been inside one of the toilet stalls. The bathroom building was massive and completely empty. She was washing her hands when something slammed into the main wooden door of the bathroom. Not a knock, a violent, echoing boom. Then she heard small footsteps running across the tiles. They stopped right outside her stall. She told us a kid's voice spoke from the other side of the thin door. It said, "Sister, why didn't you come down with me? I'm inside now. They pulled the raft in. Come play with me. Take me for a ride." Now remember, Phoebe had left for the bathroom before the raft was pulled in. She still thought the kid on the lake was a real tourist. She didn't know he had vanished, so she actually got annoyed. She yelled back through the door, telling him this was the women's restroom, that he was being rude, and that he needed to go back outside to his parents. She told us that the moment she scolded him, the kid started laughing. It was a horrible, booming, echoing laugh that vibrated against the walls. And then she heard the wet, slapping sound of bare feet, taking 3 slow steps backward, and then absolute silence. She kicked her stall door open. The massive bathroom was completely empty. There was nowhere to hide. That was when her brain caught up to the horror, and she ran. As soon as she finished the story, we all felt sick to our stomachs. I realized that the exact moment the kid vanished from the raft, out on the lake, he had materialized inside the bathroom 50 meters away, just to mess with Phoebe. We called a grab car frantically. We had to wait 20 agonizing minutes in the dark until a driver finally showed up. When we piled into the car, we were all shaking. We started complaining to the driver, cursing our luck, telling him that the guy who recommended this place set us up, and that the park was freaking haunted. The driver looked at us through the rearview mirror, his face full of pity. He told us he hadn't known we were going there, but that in the local driving community, that park was an open secret. He told us that these pop-up eco-parks often open without proper safety inspections to cash in on tourist trends. He lowered his voice and told us that just a short while ago, a family was visiting, and their young boy had wandered off near the lake. There were no lifeguards, no proper barriers. The kid fell in. They searched the woods for days, thinking he was kidnapped, until his body finally bloated and floated up from under the bamboo rafts. The owners paid off the right people, kept it out of the major news, and stayed open. But the drivers knew. We sat in the back of that car in stunned silence, but the nightmare wasn't over. In fact, it was just latching onto us. On the ride back, Phoebe sat in the very back row. She went completely mute. She just stared blankly out the rain-streaked window. We assumed she was just in shock. When the cab dropped us off near our hotel, the rain had stopped, so we decided to walk down the street to grab some grilled sweet potatoes and hot soy milk to calm our nerves. This is when Phoebe started acting wrong. Phoebe is a very mature, grounded person. She's kind of the mother hen of our group. But as we walked down the street, she started acting like a toddler. She would randomly wander up to souvenir stalls and poke at shiny toys. She picked up those silly hats with the ears that flap when you squeeze the paws, squeezing them over and over, giggling this high-pitched, vacant giggle. She touched everything. She bumped into people without apologizing. We kept looking at each other, deeply unsettled. I tried to pull her away, telling her to stop messing around, but she just gave me this blank, wide-eyed stare. We eventually sat down at a street vendor for soy milk. Phoebe didn't order. She just drank whatever we put in front of her. Then, mid-sip, her head just slumped forward, and she almost face-planted into the table. She fell asleep sitting up. I shook her shoulder hard. She jolted awake, looked around wildly, and suddenly her normal voice came back. She looked terrified and demanded to know why we were out on the street, asking why we hadn't gone straight to the hotel because she was exhausted and freezing. She had zero memory of the last 45 minutes. We rushed back to the hotel. We didn't want to freak her out, so we didn't mention her weird behavior. She went to sleep normally, but the next morning, Phoebe refused to get out of bed. She wouldn't change her clothes, wouldn't do her makeup. She just sat on the edge of the mattress, looking like a hollow shell. When we finally dragged her down to breakfast, she pushed her food around and told us about her dream. She said it wasn't a monster chasing her. It was worse because of how real it felt. She told us she spent the entire night, 6 solid hours of sleep, trapped standing on that bamboo raft in the middle of the lake. In the dream, it was daytime. She could see tourists walking along the shore. She could see us, her friends, taking pictures near the trees. She tried to use the pole to paddle back to the shore to join us, but no matter how hard she pushed, The raft wouldn't move closer than a few meters to the bank. It would just drift back out to the center. She spent 6 hours in her own mind, screaming for help, waving her arms, while strangers and her own friends just walked past, completely unable to see or hear her. And every so often, standing in the crowd on the shore, she would spot the little boy in the beanie, just staring at her with dead eyes, before vanishing behind a tree. She woke up, feeling a level of psychological exhaustion I can't even describe. We tried to cheer her up, took her to some cafes, but she was entirely checked out. By mid-afternoon, she told us she just wanted to lay in the hotel room alone. We didn't want to force her, so her boyfriend and the rest of us went out for a quick bite, leaving her in the room. We were gone for maybe 2 or 3 hours. When we came back with some takeout, we unlocked the door and found Phoebe sitting in the exact same spot on the bed where we had left her. She had a blanket pulled up over her knees, her phone resting in her lap. I offered her some food, but she held up a hand. She looked at us with this incredibly heavy, serious expression and said she needed to tell us what just happened. She told us that shortly after we left, she had to use the bathroom. Her brain sent the signal to her legs to stand up, but her body didn't move. She wasn't paralyzed like sleep paralysis. She was fully awake, sitting up, capable of scrolling on her phone. But she felt this immense, oppressive weight, keeping her pinned to the mattress. Her own body was refusing her commands. She sat there like that for almost an hour, fully conscious, needing to pee, but entirely unable to stand. And then, she told us, the voice started. She said it was a voice she recognized intimately, but it took her a minute to process why it was so familiar. The voice said, "Sister, I died down in that water. I fell off the raft and nobody looked for me. I screamed and screamed, and my mom and dad were right there on the shore, but they couldn't hear me. It's so cold down here, sister. It's so dark. I watch people paddle right over me every single day, and nobody knows I'm rotting down here. I'm so hungry. I'm so cold." Phoebe said she was terrified, looking around the empty room for the source of the kid's voice. Then she felt a drop of moisture hit her hand. She realized her jaw was aching. She reached up and touched her own face. Her mouth was hanging open, drool slipping past her lips. Her own jaw was moving. Her own tongue was forming the words. The voice she was hearing, the voice of the dead boy, was coming out of her own throat, using her own vocal cords to project his agony into the room. She was a passenger in her own skull, forced to listen to her own mouth narrate a child's drowning. It lasted for 20 minutes. She couldn't stop it. She couldn't scream. She just had to sit there, crying silently, while the entity used her body to vent its trauma. Once it finished, the invisible weight lifted, and she was left sitting in the quiet room until we walked in. Hearing her tell us this, perfectly calmly, was fucking terrifying. We didn't know what to do. We didn't know if we needed a priest, a doctor, or a flight home. But miraculously, after she confessed it to us, she snapped back to normal. She ate her food, joked around, and even wanted to go to the night market. We thought whatever had latched onto her had finally said its piece and moved on. We were wrong. The next morning, the final day of our trip, we were packing our bags. Phoebe was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring blankly at the wall again. I asked her if she was okay. She didn't look at me. She just said, in this flat, monotone voice, that we needed to go back to the ABC park. She said we had to go back right now, or this would never end. We tried to fight her on it. We told her she was crazy, that we weren't going anywhere near that place, but she just repeated it, over and over, until we finally caved. We booked another cab. The driver this time was an older local guy. When we told him the destination, he groaned and tried to talk us out of it, confirming the exact same story about the drowned kid that the first driver had told us. He said he hated driving people there because the energy was vile. We told him we had no choice. The entire ride, Phoebe stared out the window, completely unresponsive. When the cab finally pulled up to the curb, right across the street from the park's main gate, we all braced ourselves. We didn't know what she was going to do. We thought she might run into the lake. The rest of us opened our doors and stepped out onto the damp pavement. Phoebe was sitting in the back, the last one to get out. As she slid out of the seat, she suddenly stopped. She froze, her foot hovering over the asphalt. Later, she told us that in that exact split second, right next to her ear, she heard the boy's voice. Not out of her own mouth this time, just a distinct, clear whisper right against her skin. He said, "I'm going home now, sis." Phoebe blinked. She stepped out of the car, dusted off her jeans, looked around at the park entrance, and then looked at us like we were idiots. She asked us what the hell we were doing here, and told us to get back in the car so we could go to the airport. Just like that, it was over. The kid had used her like a taxi to get back to his watery grave. We piled back into the cab, the driver looking incredibly confused, as we immediately told him to turn around and leave. I still think about that day all the time. I lie awake and I just ask myself, what if we hadn't listened to her? What if we had forced her onto a plane back to Saigon while that thing was still inside her? Would she have been trapped with him forever? Would she have drowned herself in a bathtub trying to simulate the lake? I don't have the answers, but I do know this. About 3 months after we left, the ABC park was abruptly shut down by the authorities. The gates were chained, the signs torn down. I like to think someone finally investigated the safety standards, or maybe they found what was left of the boy in the mud. But sometimes, when I hear heavy rain hitting the roof of my house, all I can think about is that pitch black water, and how many other lost things are sitting at the bottom of these tourist traps, just waiting for someone to walk by so they can hitch a ride out of the dark.